Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Bennett. I'm a professor in the School of Public Health and also the faculty co-chair of the Gupta-Klinsky India Institute. What a remarkable day we had yesterday. It seemed like we followed this arc from talking about trade, technology, geopolitical tension in the region, development, the economy of nurturance, health, and we finished not just with food for the mind, but food for the body as well. So I really reflected on that tourism slogan for India about incredible India and felt that it was an incredible day of incredible ideas and incredibly thoughtful people. One highlight for me was actually the speech by Yogendra Yadav and his talk and his argument that we need to find a new reality moving forward. And I have never done this before at a conference, but it reminded me of a piece of poetry. And I wanted to read just a very short snippet to you because I thought it was a nice pivot point from yesterday going into tomorrow. It's by a poet called Alberto Rios, who's an American poet, and he says, "We can make a house called tomorrow. What we bring, finally, into the new day, every day, is ourselves. And that's all we need to start. That's everything we require to keep going. Look back for only as long as you must. Then go forward into the history you will make. Be good, then better. Write books, cure disease. Make us proud. Make yourself proud. And those who came before you, when you hear thunder, hear it as their applause." So I think it's a beautiful sunny day out there. I don't think we're going to be hearing thunder. So unfortunately, you will not hear the applause of people who went before us. But I think that today is another day that gives us an opportunity to reimagine the future and where we are heading in the future in a way that really frames it in terms of doing good things in the world. And particularly that connection between India and the US and how we can drive forward stronger partnerships in that regard. So we're going to kick off with what I think is one of the most anticipated conversations of the day, and it's going to be addressing the question, what will it take for India to become a 30 trillion economy? A provocative question. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Pravin Krishna, Professor of International Economics and Business at Johns Hopkins University, and one of the leading academic voices on trade, development, and economic policy. And he will introduce our very special guest speaker. Over to you, Pravin.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. My name is Pravin Krishna. I'm a professor of economics here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And it's a great pleasure and honor for me today to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Anantha Nageswaran, who is currently the CEA, or the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. As CEA, he serves as the primary advisor to the Indian government on a wide variety of issues concerning the Indian economy. Prior to starting as CEA, Anantha served in a variety of roles as a banker, as a scholar, as an academic administrator. And over the years, we've had the benefit of his experience and his articulate, creative, and incisive views on a number of issues facing Indian policymakers, from macroeconomics, international trade, health, education, as well as India's role in the global coordination for climate action. So for today, we've requested Dr. Nageswaran's thoughts and his assessment on India's path towards developed country, or Viksit Bharat status, an aspirational goal that Prime Minister Modi has envisioned and set for India to achieve by 2047, 100 years after independence. So thank you very much, Anantha, for joining us, for taking time out on a Saturday evening in New Delhi, for joining us, I should say. We'll proceed as follows. A CEA will speak for about 20 minutes, following which we'll engage him with questions from myself and then from the floor. Thank you, Anantha. Over to you.
Thank you, Pravin. Should I wait? Should I wait or should I get going?
You're on screen and you can get started. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So good morning to everybody, and very happy to be able to join you at the two-day Johns Hopkins India Conference. In fact, Pravin, just to be very truthful, I'm right now speaking to you from a city called Coimbatore, down south in the state of Tamil Nadu. because my mother needed some attention. So I had come here. So heading back to Delhi tomorrow. But and I think we are speaking within an hour of the news breaking out that there is a ceasefire between India and Pakistan after a few days of clashes along the border. So that reduces the number of uncertainties that we are facing from n to n minus 1, because there are plenty of things to be concerned about and be mindful about as we go into the rest of the year. So without much further ado, I will share a few slides with you all, and then we can have a conversation after my slides are done. So I'm just going to start with the India's policy challenges and priorities and approaches amidst a global paradigm shift. So basically, I want to start out by saying that while there is a lot of anxiety about the current trade-related uncertainties and each country looking out for its interest, etc., and what many perceive to be the end of globalization, I feel that most of the seeds of the current dislocation in the global order were actually sown at the time of the global financial crisis, when central banks resorted to unconventional monetary policy, combining quantitative easing and zero interest rates. And as this independent fund manager, Alberto Gallo, put it in 2020, these developments were slowly leading to schism within societies and across countries. And as he currently very presciently put it at the end of the bottom of the slide, this would have been expected to result in trade wars, financial repression, and military conflicts. So in 2020, in February, he came up with this schema, and it looks very prescient as to where we are in some sense. So I think sometimes we are more focused on the symptoms of the dislocation, but the underlying causes started much earlier, and probably some of them may even date it to the beginning of the millennium. So the truth is, we have been inching towards the current situation rather than suddenly finding ourselves in the middle of global order dislocation. It has been in the making. The next slide is to focus on the China dominance of global manufacturing. And if you look at this slide produced by the Access Capital in India, if you look at the left side, you can see that without the United States, there are no imports in the world. The import curve of rest of the world is flat. Similarly, on the right side, if you look at the China exports and then exclude that, the export curve for the rest of the world is flat. So clearly, it's about imbalances on both sides. One country is excessively importing, another country is excessively exporting, and this imbalance needs to be fixed. And it was not sustainable, and something of this nature should have been expected. And all disruptions, when they occur, they are disorienting, and that is human nature to feel disoriented. But the status quo wasn't unsustainable, and this slide captures it very, very well. But this is the global backdrop. I just want to move on to Indian situation. So how do we sustain India's growth amidst these uncertainties? And there are some tailwinds as well for India. I'll first talk about those tailwinds, global context. First of all, oil prices have really plunged, and whether or not they are passed on to Indian households and businesses, it will reduce India's import bill and also boost the exchequer, the treasury, because India imposes a considerable amount of taxes on petrol and diesel compared to many other developing countries. So that is a good news for India. And then the tariffs also, China plus one has been slow in benefiting in India in the last several years post-COVID. But this time it feels different, as many companies are looking to position themselves away from China, knowing fully well that the US administration is focused on ensuring that both the direct exports and transshipment-based exports coming out of China will not be as easy as they used to be. So neutral or friendlier countries are getting a much closer look than before. So I think the China plus one has a second wind as far as India is concerned, as you can see at the bottom of this chart, the Bloomberg header regarding what Apple intends to do. vis-a-vis its production facilities. And if you look at the four different product areas: leather, chemicals, clothing, and non-electric machinery, while the current duties faced by India and Vietnam are 10% because the reciprocal tariffs have been put on a suspension mode. The fact remains that tariffs on China are still very high. And in these product areas, which are relatively labor intensive, especially leather and clothing, India can actually stand to benefit. And this is a competitive tailwind that India has to take advantage of. And it is not just an automatic competitive advantage. India needs to work for it. And there are some internal changes that need to happen. And I will talk about some of them later on in the next few minutes. But definitely, given the huge duty gap between India and China, it is an opportunity that India can and should take advantage of to be able to raise its export share in the global markets. So moving on from these two global tailwinds, one is energy price and one is opening to become more competitive. I move on to where Indian economy currently is. I think the estimated growth rate for the year that just finished in March 2025 is 6.5% for India in real terms. And for the current financial year, we are 6 weeks into it. The expected growth rate, as far as the Ministry of Finance is concerned, is between 6.3 and 6.8%. And there are estimates that are now being revised up and down depending on the way the things were going. But I think anything above 6% looks eminently feasible because of the tailwinds. And most people forget the fact that the government of India announced a very strong tax relief for middle-class households in the budget in February 2025, and they would kick in this financial year, boosting household disposable income and therefore consumption possibilities. And India's growth differential with the rest of the world has widened in India's favor in the last few years post-COVID. And even though India's growth rate may be lower compared to the first 3 years after COVID, it still carries a wide gap with the other countries, and that is important in the current scheme of things in the world, making India an attractive place for investors, both portfolio and direct investors. The other good news, sort of a silver lining, is if you look at the left-hand side, you can see that Indian exports did quite well in the year 24-25. Because India's financial year runs from April to March, compared to the previous years when export was a net drag. But net exports added to GDP numbers in 24-25. And I think the current tariff differential that India has, and also being in advanced state of conversation with the United States and having concluded a trade agreement with the UK, which was about 3.5 to 4 years in the making, I think India can, even in this difficult global environment, attempt to boost its exports as it has done in 24-25. And more interestingly and importantly, the high frequency indicators that we track in the Ministry of Finance do not signal any loss of momentum in the economy in the current financial year in the first 5 to 6 weeks. But there are challenges, as I mentioned, and I'll come to those challenges. First, I want to talk about the overall global South, India, a part of it. If you distill the development experience of developed countries, Robert Allen has done that from University of British Columbia in a lecture that he gave in 2013. He said 5 ingredients were there for developed countries when they were growing. And they practiced internal free market, but not external market. They were external tariff. They actually opened themselves up to the world and demanded that the world open to them only when they established their own technological capabilities. They had stable domestic banking system, high external tariff, as I mentioned earlier, good education, and good physical infrastructure. India definitely is ticking at least 2 or 3 of those boxes. Physical infrastructure has improved leaps and bounds in the last 10 years. And education enrollments have picked up tremendously, but education outcomes need a lot of work to be done. The banking system is stable after having endured a financial banking system crisis in the second decade of the millennium, and the goods and services tax has created an internal free market. And even though some wrinkles need to be ironed out, it definitely has engendered a national single market in India. So, and external tariffs, India actually has been lowering tariff, but that is not easy for developing countries because they need that wall of protection. But then protection cannot be given without some performance obligations on the part of the industry, which is what Northeast Asia did very well when they were growing in the 1960s to 1990s. Those countries did subsidize, did have an active industrial policy, but they did demand performance from their industry. So I think protection without performance standards and accountability is basically a deadweight loss for the economy. The second dimension that India needs to be mindful about is, of course, the energy transition or energy diversification. Development history tells us that the developed world became developed on the back of the Great Plague, which completely eliminated 1/4 to 1/3 of able-bodied men. The labor force shrunk, real wages went up, and capital-led growth became feasible and economically viable as well, which is what led to scale-based technology and capital-led growth in the developed world. But therefore, that model of development is alien and not favorable, conducive for countries like India, which have huge labor endowment. So we are starting with the handicap, having inherited a model that arose out of labor shortage. But more importantly, that model worked very well for developed countries because they had abundant and cheap energy, which is what energy transition threatens to upend for most of us. And also, if you look at what happened in Spain and Portugal and France 2 weeks ago, it reminds us that it requires a lot of investments for us to make renewable energy viable and feasible and also competitive. And that is a paradox or a trade-off that developing countries have to navigate. So this is the challenge that India is confronting, apart from the fact that it is attempting an economic transformation with such a huge population in a democratic framework, and trying to do so when energy transition and capital-led growth are not necessarily tailwinds for India, but India has to grapple with them and grow. So this is the backdrop. But internally within the country, India has to address these 7 issues. And the 4 top ones are the areas where policy has to be very active. It can't be left to market forces. But the bottom 3 bullet points are the ones that can be more or less addressed by the markets. So that is the distinction that government has to make. So for the bottom 3 to succeed, we need more deregulation. For the top 4 to succeed, we need public policy which recognizes the trade-offs in India, and also investment in primary and secondary education, and also social responsibility on the part of businesses with respect to physical and mental health of the Indian demographic bulge. So let me move on to these dimensions. We spoke about the energy affordability, energy security, and energy transition. One important development that I mentioned already earlier about the Spain, Portugal, France blackout that happened 2 weeks ago. And I think the important thing is, as Aviar Blas from Bloomberg captured it very well, green activists see hardly any problem with electrifying everything. And they believe any concerns represent little more than attempts to delay a needed transition away from fossil fuels. But climate deniers only see trouble in renewables, EV and other green technologies, forgetting all the risks that oil and coal and gas bring along. In between both positions lies the reality. I think this is very well put. I think countries have to choose their own pace of transition. And we, in our current stage of development, with a lower per capita income than many other countries, cannot afford to sacrifice energy security and affordability for energy transition. Mind you, India's development goal, Viksit Bharat 2047, comes 23 years ahead of India's goal for net zero by 2070. And second aspect that India is to be mindful of is its dependence on global markets for many products that we need, ingredients we need for energy transition and for electrification of transportation, particularly China with respect to graphite, nickel, lithium, copper, etc. India actually renders itself more vulnerable. If we think India is over-dependent on Persian Gulf for crude oil, this creates a completely different level of dependency with a geopolitical rival as well, with whom India has had unresolved border issues as well. So could be an area of strategic vulnerability. Therefore, India needs to treat carefully crossing the river by feeling the stones when it comes to energy transition. Uh, while everybody speaks about what the government should do about, bringing tariffs down and deregulating, which I will come to, Indian private sector also has a very important role to play in a large society such as ourselves. The private sector in particular has to take care of these 7 aspects: balanced deployment of capital and labor, the kind of ultra processed foods which are now very clearly linked to mental health issues, and capital and labor share of incomes is also important consideration. Again, that is an important issue in the advent of AI, workplace safety in the factory sector, workplace culture and mental health, strategic thinking for a resilient India, investment in R&D, and balanced deployment of capital and labor. These are the important asks that India as a society has from the private sector. Private sector profitability has improved tremendously in the last 15, 13 years or so, but the capital formation was understandably slow because of balance sheet problems they faced. So they had to rebuild their balance sheets and direct accumulated earnings towards better balance sheets. But now is the time to recognize India's very strong and large domestic market, and the private sector has to undertake capital formation and set in motion a virtuous circle of investment, hiring, compensation, demand growth, more investments, etc. So the endogeneity of investment, employment, and demand growth has to be recognized by the Indian businesses. And then balanced deployment of AI and capital, because India has a unique problem. It has a demographic bulge and it needs to capitalize on it. So we don't want AI to not just be not labor displacing, but it should be actually labor augmenting, because we need to create 8 million jobs a year for the next 10 to 15 years. And therefore, Indian businesses have to think very hard about the medium term. Many of the trade-offs that we face disappear when we lengthen our horizon to include the medium term, and AI and labor and hiring is one such issue. There are no templates here, but the industry has to be mindful of its social responsibility, but it is also in its own self-interest if it doesn't kill the golden goose, that without labor income and disposable income growth, there is no aggregate demand growth and there is no private sector profitability. So this is a trade-off that they need to recognize. And this is a very good paper that talks about AI and jobs, because end-to-end AI agent is a technological and policy choice. We do face a genuine choice about whether these systems are trained at all, which is not an inevitable technological destiny. And this is where policy has to be very firm, that how much we allow AI to make inroads into the job market is a policy choice. It can't be left to simply the AI industry itself. And about the fairer distribution of income I spoke about, the profitability growth post-COVID has been tremendous, but employee expenses growth has been relatively tepid. So that is clearly India cannot import some of the models that the developed countries, especially Anglo-Saxon countries, are facing in terms of capital labor share of incomes. It is also a social issue that needs to be kept in mind. And ultra-processed foods are very well associated with mental health and also productivity issues. And that is something that is not economics speak about, but they have a huge implication for productivity, especially with respect to the young population. So combination of unhealthy foods, screen time, social media consumption, all of them basically is a toxic combination for economic productivity. What the government should do, in my last 2 minutes, I will speak about the importance of deregulation. India has done a lot to ease business conditions, but bulk of the regulation at the level of state government still remains, and land and building use guidelines are still very oppressive, and they raise the fixed cost of doing business. We have covered all of this in chapter 5 of the economic survey in great detail that we brought out in January 2025. And we have given examples where Indian regulations actually make it costlier to do business. And that is one of the reasons why India's small and medium enterprises have not grown as Japan, Germany, Switzerland, UK had in their heydays. And we have induced in them a fear of growth. And deregulation will remove the fear of growth. And that is the work that public policy has to focus on, while we spoke earlier about the private sector's obligations. And trust has to be built. Societies like India have a high trust within groups, communities, and networks, but low trust without. And this is the gap that needs to be bridged. A low trust society, therefore, ends up over regulating, compensating for low trust, which further engenders low trust. And I think the government has to take the lead in breaking this cycle between low trust and higher regulation by deregulating and using technology to take care of the offenders and perpetual cheaters. So in conclusion, I think based on the IMF forecast released in April 2025, India looks set to become a 5 trillion economy in the financial year 2027-2028, heading towards 7 trillion just after the turn of the decade. And India's currency will not be depreciating at the rate of 3% per annum as it did in the last 3 decades, but very gently. In fact, there is a possibility that Indian rupee may actually end up appreciating in the immediate future up to 2030 rather than depreciating. So India has everything to play for, and if both private and public sector know where they need to act. And interestingly, this is my last slide. Interestingly, among the youth or the population surveyed by the Edelman Trust Barometer survey every year, developing country population have still a lot of faith with respect to their future and optimism, which is not to be found in developing countries. You can see Saudi Arabia, China, India, Indonesia, and UAE, 60% of those polled said the next generation will be better off. It is up to the Indian private sector and the public sector to fully vindicate the trust and the optimism that Indians have towards their future. Thank you very much. I hope this sets the tone for the conversation with Pravin. Back to you, Pravin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anantha. That was really great. A real tour de force in terms of coverage of the number of issues that India faces. Just broadly, so the audience is aware as well, India's had kind of a broad challenge of structural transformation of the Indian economy. You have a large number of people, maybe somewhere between 40 to 50% of the workforce that's still employed in the agricultural sector, which generates maybe 15% or so of output. The manufacturing part of the economy has been relatively stagnant despite very impressive economic reforms that have been undertaken over the last many decades, and some very recently as well, in terms of improvements in the physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure, as well as Anantha has mentioned. And then you, of course, have the services sector. So as one sort of, and there's a question for you, Anantha, as one looks at this broad challenge of the structural transformation of the economy away from agriculture into manufacturing services, taking into account the demographic bulge, as you mentioned, the very large number of sort of young Indians looking for productive, good jobs. From where you sit as CEA, you've sort of mentioned a number of different policies potentially that the government of India could sort of adopt and so on. When you take into account the politics and the political economy of the system overall, do you see any low-hanging fruit, things that could be done relatively easily? You've touched on a number of different dimensions here, but as you kind of, are there easy things for the government of India to do that you recommend they do right away, for example? We need to switch the audio.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I had muted myself. So the low-hanging fruit that you talk about is precisely what I wanted to, what I tried to hint at. This is deregulation. Some of the land building labor codes, what we in India call Shops and Establishment Act, Factories Act, prohibition of women from certain occupations because they are deemed physically unsafe, and are not allowing women to work night shifts by ensuring physical safety, etc. There are plenty of low-hanging fruits in terms of nuts and bolts of regulation, which actually hold back job creation, raise the fixed cost of doing business. So to some extent, you can consider it a blessing in disguise because removing them itself can unlock a lot of productivity growth. Agriculture in particular, and I didn't mention that in the interest of time, I think it's very important that we still think agriculture is not an industry or a sector of the future, of the past. I'm sorry, of the past. It is still a sector of the future because if you look at agriculture and allied services, that is fisheries, horticulture, dairy, and pulses and fruits, etc., they have been growing at double the growth rate of food grains in India because those sectors very much operate according to market forces. The producers in these areas do not have to face restraints on where to sell, when to sell, how much to sell, whom to sell, and at what prices to sell. I think we still need to do that and liberate the farming sector. Despite the extensive subsidies we give, we still constrain them. And I think, therefore, we still have a lot of room for agricultural productivity. You mentioned the fact that more than 40% work in the agricultural sector and the output contribution is around 20%. I think there is a huge opportunity there as well. That's also a low-hanging fruit in some sense. The other low-hanging fruit can be in higher education, where I think India can definitely, in particular areas, science, technology, medicine, engineering, we can actually open it up to private sector, foreign competition, etc. And I think that will also create the huge reservoir of skilled population that India needs to be able to participate in capital-intensive growth. I think these are areas that I would consider relatively low-hanging fruits. Back to you.
Thank you, Anantha. If I could turn your attention over to sort of the external sector for India, international trade.
Right.
On the one hand, as you mentioned, there's a sort of new opportunity for India, sometimes referred to as the kind of the China plus one sort of circumstance, where India, with the United States and other countries maybe want to diversify away from their over-dependence, over-reliance on their economic relations with China, and then an opportunity arises for India. That's on the one hand. On the other, in terms of India's own relations, economic relations with China, we have our own concerns about international trade with China. We have a growing trade deficit with China that concerns us in much the same way, perhaps, as, although at a smaller scale, as the US is concerned. And so how do you see this sort of the China conundrum for India? Should we be trading more with China ourselves, trading more in intermediate inputs, engage more in Chinese FDI? How do we make ourselves competitive from a regional standpoint in terms of kind of regional global value chains and so forth? How do we become a sort of a better partner in that China plus one setting as well from the standpoint of the other countries in the world?
So, I mean, first of all, let me admit that it is not an easy question to answer because, yes, there is the massive import dependence that India has because China's exports to India have doubled in just 3 years post-COVID. Although the export from China came down a little bit in the calendar year 2024 from 2020, from 2023, around $120 billion, it came to $107 or $108 billion in the last calendar year. But it was just $60 billion in 2021. So it doubled and then has come off slightly. So the massive dependence of India for, let's say, antibiotics or EV-related components, battery cells, the battery chemicals, etc., and also with respect to solar modules and polysilicon wafers. I think there is a lot of dependence there. We are trying to build capacity, but still these dependencies, as I showed in one of my slides, are areas of strategic vulnerability, actually. And therefore, one way is to look at is to other countries where the cost may be even higher slightly, but you may have to diversify. That is one aspect. And also it's important for India to talk to many other producers who may be producing in China but selling to India and to rest of the world, and therefore they need to be induced to be able to relocate production in India to sell in the Indian market, and also to be able to sell to the rest of the world by producing in India as well. There are no easy answers. This is not going to happen overnight. And then, of course, the production linked incentive scheme that the government of India had created about a few years ago, post COVID, I think does have potential for India to develop indigenous capabilities. And it's happened in some areas, whether it is in mobile phones or consumer products such as refrigerators, air conditioners, and even in the labor-intensive toy making sector, etc. The import content from China has come down significantly, but we need to replicate it in pharmaceutical, in the active pharma ingredients, and that's a challenge for which even the US faces, by the way. APIs, or for that matter, in renewable energy areas as well. So it is a multi-year task, and we have just begun. I think the one way is to focus on foreign producers located in China to be able to at least shift partial manufacturing to India, and for the Indian industry to invest in R&D. And that is the other major component of this reduction in dependence on one single country for many of the critical products. Back to you.
Thank you, Anantha. My last question, then we could have some questions from the floor as well. So if you're any of you with questions from the floor, should make your way to the mic, and I'll turn that over to you. But my last question to you, Anantha, is you've written a lot and you've thought a lot about India's sort of energy transition in the context of the climate goals. Could you elaborate a bit on how India sees its position with respect to these issues relative to what the rest of the world appears to be expecting India to do? And so could you elaborate for us on that? Yeah.
Thanks, Pravin. I think, first of all, India is committed to net zero. India is committed to net zero by 2070. And in terms of meeting its nationally determined contribution in G20, India actually is leading the pack in terms of meeting its own NDC commitment on emission reduction. And then in terms of additions to renewable energy capacity, or in terms of reducing the energy intensity of economic growth, we are doing much better than many other countries. So in that sense, India is committed to the fact that energy transition needs to happen. And for India's own purposes, such as air and water pollution, we do need to diversify. So there is no denying, there is no gainsaying the importance of doing this. What is important is for developed countries to come forward with the technology, with the financial commitments that they made, which has not happened. And therefore, it has become an unequal bargain, unequal conversation. That said, at the same time, as I also mentioned to you, the history of economic development has been based on capital, technology-led growth backed by abundant and cheap power. And as things stand, renewable energy is economical only after multiple and extensive subsidies provided by the state, and a country with low per capita income like India, it has to therefore have multiple competing trade-offs when it comes to capital formation and investment requirements. Therefore, we need to ensure that we do adaptation investment much more than emission reduction investment, relatively speaking, in the next few years. We need to generate economic growth to generate the fiscal resources to invest in emission reduction later. We need to focus on energy demand management, public transportation, and indigenous solutions for reducing energy demand, because much of the global approach is towards identifying non-fossil fuel sources of supply, even while energy demand is galloping because of AI, for example, data centers. But we need to focus on energy demand management as well. And then lastly, we need to invest a lot more in nuclear energy than we are currently contemplating, and the budget for 25-26 makes a very important start there by letting private sector come into nuclear power generation and removing the supplier liability so that foreign collaboration can happen. So these are all the mechanisms and the elements of India's energy transition policy, whereas the destination is unambiguous, is clear. It is the path and the pace that India has to be mindful about, being sensitive to its development needs in the near term. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Anantha. We have maybe about 5 minutes for questions from the floor. 5 or 10 minutes? All right. So we have a gentleman here at the mic. Maybe we could take a couple of questions at a time. So if you'd briefly just sort of introduce yourself and then address the CEA with your question. Thank you.
Yeah, Chris McRae. So Stanford AI Index has published that it expects India to be one of the 3 or 4 most vibrant AI nations for youth. If Modi, Ambani, and people like Jensen Huang and Jan LeCun help in maximal ways. But my question is, how come Bloomberg, Carey, Seiss, and all of us most help with AI in India?
Thank you. We'll take another question as well.
Can I pile
please?
on that one from this side?
Oh,
Because my question was going to be the same.
go ahead,
Hi,
please. Yes.
I'm Ramaswamy Varyankaval from JP Morgan. Not to sound too critical, sir, but your comments around AI sounded a bit defensive to me. I mean, putting the importance of labor in the center of this conversation seems, again, a bit defensive to me when the rest of the world, this is, if you look long term, this seems to be the engine of growth. And I haven't heard of an Indian AI company. Again, granted, I'm in the States. So again, I think it's a similar question. What can India do more? Hopefully, we are thinking more about the long-term prospects of AI and how that's the growth engine. Thank you.
Did you have an AI question as well, sir, or should we just have the AI response first before we get to you?
I wanted to add to this question. Do you have something? Okay.
Another AI question. Go ahead. Yeah.
Kind of a common bit of a question. I am a grad student at Hopkins. I'm graduating soon. I study security. I personally have done AI security research, and my research was quite interesting in school. So Hopkins has asked me to be a founder for carrying forward this research in States. I have checked resources in India of how I could have something like this because I feel the infrastructure and the employees would be more affordable from a founder perspective. And the websites are so confusing and so overwhelming, and I don't know if there are any strong VC funds up front that are in support with the government. I have looked at Viksit Bharat as well. It's a bit of a comment about how the ecosystem is a bit confusing, but when you do sit here as a student in Hopkins, in States, it takes like $500 and the school is ready to register the company for you. I would like to hire more Indian people because I have been in that space. I have worked in India and I feel the market is so much more better and people are highly qualified. They're not getting paid well. I don't understand how to navigate this ecosystem because it's not that these companies don't exist. I just feel they need more clarity to exist, and I would love to have something of that sort.
Thank you. So Anantha, a couple of questions for you on AI. What can we do as a university, Johns Hopkins? What can India do?
Yeah.
How can things be facilitated?
Yeah, I think, Pravin, perhaps you should organize another session inviting Mr. S. Krishnan from the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology to talk to them about AI. And I come at it only from the macro perspective. I think India does have tremendous potential, given the fact that India generates a lot of data in the first place, given its population size, and also its a huge army of qualified human resources in the engineering technology side. I think at the same time, I think the question that posed by, therefore, I think it is possible to hold both views at the same time. One is that India has a tremendous contribution to make to the development advancement of AI. And it's equally possible to hold the view that India has to be mindful of the trade-offs. And I think the gentleman who from JP Morgan who posed this question said, I'm defensive. No, I'm not. I'm just, my job is to actually, when consensus is tilted in one direction, it is my job to point out the trade-offs because no public policy is without trade-offs. while there is plenty of scope for improvement in clinical diagnosis or in customer service, and in terms of improving productivity of own frontline customer service employees, etc. We know that AI can help, and also in research and also writing good briefs. So in all these areas, I can very well understand, or in sort of basically being able to turn complex data sets into easily understandable set of policy conclusions, etc. Many of these things AI can do very well and augment capabilities. But it's very important for a country like India because we have to create 8 billion jobs. And the advancement of AI is exciting for countries which are facing an aging problem. And there AI can easily substitute for labor that is dwindling in any case. Whereas we have until 2040 or 2045, where we have to create jobs as well, and also create AI entrepreneurs, etc. So it's a question of balancing act. And my views should be seen in the light of the fact that there is plenty of optimism and plenty of excitement in the corporate sector about introducing AI in India, which is understandable. But at the same time, I want to remind them, and that is why I even mentioned that paper. If the gentleman who asked me this question, if he had not read that paper yet, I would recommend that he do so. And therefore, it's important to keep in mind both perspectives. So there is potential for India to contribute to global AI development and benefit from it. And equally, AI introduction and infusion into the Indian corporate sector has to keep in mind both labor displacement risks and its risk for creating future employment. And I will stand by that. And it is not being defensive, it is being proactive.
Thank you, Anantha. Let's maybe just a couple more questions, gentlemen. Your turn, sir.
Sure. This, of course, touches on AI, but other industries as well. It's more of a policy and perhaps even a culture question. You talked about the essential need for a publicly responsible, socially responsible private sector. The model of achieving that in the West seems to be low regulation, waiting till private sector makes a mess of things, then bring in the PR people and the lawyers and massive lawsuits, et cetera. We've seen that with the tobacco industry, with the food industry. You mentioned ultra-processed foods, chemical industries, et cetera. In China, it seems like the model has more government control and direction to major industries. Is India going to forge its own path in solving this perennial problem that the West and I think China has also not done a good job of?
Thank you. We'll take one question here, and then maybe that's the last question. Yeah.
Okay. So my question is, I know that recently with Tesla, I think they signed a deal where they could build more cars in India. And I also know that India has car manufacturer from India. Why are these cars available for the international market? The cars that are from India, from the Indian companies. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe one last question from our PhD student over here, Prakhar Mishra. Go ahead, Prakhar.
Thanks for your talk, sir. Quick question on the deregulation of the external sector. You've spoken about land markets and labor markets. Could you talk a little about, ideas like moving towards fuller capital account convertibility? And just, we know from the past that liberalizing the external sector has helped, removing quantitative restrictions on imports, created a huge impact on the economy. So would love to hear your views on that. Thank you.
All right, we have one very last question, and then we'll hand it over to you, Anantha.
Okay.
I'm sorry. One last question. Yes.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. So I'm Sandupal. I'm a Hopkins student. So my question is, have you given a thought to the kind of future climate risks and its impacts on various sectors of the economy? Like how is climate change, climate risks is going to have, for example, affect the manufacturing sector, for example, affect the services sector? And do you sort of look at modeling those kind of effects that may have under different scenarios? So that is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Anantha, yours.
There are 4 questions or four observations and questions. On the private sector and social responsibility and deregulation, the answer is somewhat boring in the sense that we need to be able to do both. We need to deregulate extensively when it comes to factories and the production sector and small and medium enterprises. And as I also said in my slide where I showed 7 bullets on the long-term structural challenges, the first 4 require more active public policy intervention, maybe even government directing how the sector or the industry develops. Whereas in the bottom 3, I said there is room for more competition, market forces to play their part. So as you could see from my comments on the observations on that slide, I'm looking for a blend of the two. And so in that sense, we do need deregulation. I mentioned higher education as an example. We do need regulation for small and medium enterprises, removing fear of growth. And also we need deregulation in agriculture. What is happening in non-food grain sectors should actually happen in the food grains area as well, rice, wheat, cotton, sugarcane, etc. Whereas in other areas which are relatively minor share of agriculture, there is free markets that are at work. So in all these areas, we can pull back and let the market forces do their part, and the government can create a level playing field. But in some areas, I think we need to be more active with policy and even regulation. So that is my answer. It is not obviously an either or type of answer. I think we need a better mix of the two. And I think we may have found the right balance when it comes to digital public infrastructure. India's DPI, or digital public infrastructure, has evolved with the government setting the initial development and then the stack getting built by the private sector on top of that, keeping in mind India's relatively low per capita income. So there we have demonstrated that public and private sector can work together and actually create a globally winning product. And that is the kind of template that we need to follow in other sectors as well. I think when it comes to the question on automobile, I'm not entirely sure. India does have an automobile sector, the internal combustion engine based sector. And India also has domestic manufacturers producing electric vehicles. And of course, the domestic value addition could be relatively low at this point in the EV production. And Tesla coming in, if it does, I don't know. I don't think that it's imminent as far as I can think of. Tesla coming in could actually create more competition and a faster growth of indigenization or value addition happening in the EV sector among Indian manufacturers. So I don't see a contradiction between the two. Now, when it comes to external sector and capital account convertibility, etc., India has proceeded at a gradual pace and it has served India well so far. And the capital account is indeed open for non-residents, 100%. And that is why I think the bond index inclusion happened despite India still holding on to its tax deduction at source. When it comes to residents, up to $250,000 per year per person, actually Indians can actually hold foreign assets and foreign currency as well. So I think liberalization of the external sector is something that India has been doing over the last 30 years and will continue to do so. In fact, India's foreign remittances by Indian domestic residents at $250,000 per capita is 5 times higher than, for example, what China has, which has almost 5 times more per capita income than India has. So I think it is already afoot. And the very last question, I beg your pardon, I forgot.
Risks.
On climate risks in different sectors, are we modeling them? Are we trying to understand the impact of climate risk on different sectors? Yes, the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change is, and the private sector and the different government think tanks like Niti Aayog, etc., are coming up with modeling climate risk for different sectors, and those studies are happening, and that information is being disseminated, and there is plenty of activity happening domestically with respect to how to manage the climate. That is why I said the important thing is to focus on adaptation, because even if India stops emitting greenhouse gases from today, the historical accumulated greenhouse gases will give us global warming for the next 20, 30 years. No questions. There is no doubt about that. So that is why it's important to prepare ourselves and invest in adaptation measures. And MOEFCC, the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change, and industry bodies are working on that. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Anantha, for this very truly outstanding overview of the N-1 issues that India faces. Thank you for taking the time. We wish your mother the best, and for you, safe travels back to New Delhi. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Wish you 2 days of good deliberations. Thank you.